Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was about to deliver one of the biggest speeches of his career, and he knew it. Reverend King was preparing to deliver a speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, and his soul was disturbed. Prior to this event, Reverend King did not write out speeches. He only used notes, but not in a prepared manuscript. However, for this occasion, he knew the eyes of the nation would be on him as the keynote speaker. Nervous about the event, he carefully wrote out his speech, even calling friends and colleagues asking for suggestions. He had several manuscripts, and finally on the day of the speech, he had a final product. He stepped in front of the microphone and froze. He clutched the papers in his hands tighter. The title of his message was Normalcy, Never Again. But as he stood before the crowd, he couldn't unclench his hand. He couldn't look at the speech he had spent so many hours writing, because he knew what he held was not the message he was supposed to deliver to an eager crowd. As he struggled to speak, the wonderful gospel singer, Mathilda Jackson, who sat slightly behind him, called out, "Tell them the dream, Martin." Martin heard her, and he did. The most famous refrain from his speech, "I have a dream," wasn't written in his notes nor in his manuscript. He simply told the audience his dream. His dream that children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. A few lines later, he told the audience, "I have a dream where every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together." Reverend King's powerful dream was a dream shared by many prophets, including the prophet Isaiah. A dream for a world of equality and love. A dream that delivered hope. Reverend King was a dreamer, and as a dreamer, things did not go well for him. As one author reminds us, then as now, dreamers make the powers that be, the powers that fear change, uncomfortable. And as a consequence, the powers that be became desperate to bury the dream. Turning our attention to the Old Testament text, at the beginning of Genesis 37, Joseph had multiple dreamers. He was a dreamer. He had God-sent visions about the future. Though I have to admit, I believe Joseph was a ninny. There, I said it. After all, he told his brothers that they would become his servants. Who does that? Seriously. Some scholars suggest that Joseph told his brothers his dreams because he was so spoiled, he was completely insensitive to how his words would affect them. But others point out that in that day, when a person had a vision from God, they were expected to share it, no matter how the dream impacted the lives of others or may have affected their personal safety. At any rate, it is probably no surprise that Joseph's brothers hated their younger brother and intended to kill him. But when they had the opportunity, they mostly spared his life and sold him into slavery. After that, Joseph encountered a series of misadventures and ends up in an Egyptian prison where his ongoing visions helped his captors. Eventually, his dreams and visions earned him trust with the Egyptian officials, and he was elevated in Pharaoh's court as Pharaoh's chief of staff. In one of Joseph's dreams, he warned Pharaoh that a terrible famine was going to strike Egypt, and he instructed the Pharaoh how to avoid starvation for the royal family and the empire. With the granaries filled, Joseph's starving brothers came to Egypt and groveled before the mighty Egyptian official, not realizing he was their younger brother. Thus, the dream they found so offensive was fulfilled. Joseph revealed his true identity, and though he had every right to exact revenge on his brothers, instead he forgave them, and he invited them to stay in Egypt with him, where there was plenty of food and resources. Reflecting on the fulfillment of Joseph's dreams, Joseph trusted the dreams where God sent, and obeying the vision, hope was created. However, we're also reminded that to fulfill God's desire for hope and for hope to be realized, there's a great amount of risk involved, as the wise men discovered in Matthew's gospel. In Matthew, the wise men, or magi, or kings, or sages, and I'm sure there's several other ways they've been referred to in biblical translations, but the point is, these folks are mysterious. We don't know where they're from. Perhaps they're magi. These magi are survivors of the transition of power from Babylonia to the Persian Empire. Or maybe they could be descendants of the stargazers that are briefly mentioned in the book of Daniel. At any rate, these foreign seers or astrologers are dreamers, and they receive a vision of hope for the world. These dreamers follow a star to the city of Jerusalem, the location of the Holy Temple, and King Herod's castle. After all, that's where a king must be born, right? Well, no. When King Herod discovered what the dreamers were seeking, he immediately felt threatened by their quest. After all, the promised newborn king threatened his dynasty, and King Herod violently became jealous because he had been in office long enough to know a threat to his rule when he saw one. Well, Herod pretended he wanted to worship the newborn king, so he approached the Magi and requested that after they found the newborn king, they should return with an update about the young king's location. The Magi happily agreed, but something felt off about the king's request. So after they found Jesus and delivered their gifts, they knew they could not return to King Herod's palace. They had to find another way out, and they had to do so without running into any of Herod's troops. And they had to do so by avoiding the whistleblowers so as the child would not be located. As you can imagine, when the Magi did not return with news regarding the newborn, King Herod was livid. Through surveillance channels, aka spies, he discovered the Magi had stopped in Bethlehem. And so he tweeted out a message to his troops, "Go out and destroy this child. Kill every toddler in Bethlehem." Here's where the historical record and the biblical narrative take different routes. To date, there is no historical evidence that any toddlers were actually killed in Bethlehem. No diary entries or written reports exist. Perhaps this Epiphany story is simply told as a theological story to shore up Jesus' identity as the Messiah. In that light, this story declares that Jesus is more important than King Herod or Caesar or any of the world's powerful leaders. On the other hand, though no written record exists about this event outside the biblical narrative, it's likely that any reports about this incident were probably suppressed. Likely King Herod declared the reports were fake news, and eyewitnesses to the tragic event were imprisoned as enemies of the state, or they were simply labeled as lunatics. I believe King Herod squashed the news about the events that took place in Bethlehem because he thought he succeeded. He thought he destroyed the child who threatened his kingdom, and he thought he buried the dream. However, the dream was spared. God spoke to Jesus' earthly father, Joseph, who also was a dreamer, and Joseph received instructions to flee Bethlehem to avoid Herod's wrath. Now, I invite you to imagine that journey. Mary and Joseph had to sneak out of town and avoid Herod's checkpoints. They had to avoid the highways and hotels. They had to avoid strangers who might be sympathetic to Herod. They had to keep their heads low, and they had to blend in. Despite the danger, the dream Joseph had was clear, and he and Mary fled, though the way was difficult, especially since they either had to drop south and travel through the mountainous regions, trekking through snow and ice, or they took a northern route through the miserable desert where they would encounter blistering heat during the day with little to no shade, and encounter extremely cold nights as they made their way toward Egypt to hop the border so they could be free of tyranny and violence. But they knew they had to go. The dream said they would find freedom from hatred. They also knew they were going to raise the ultimate dreamer, their son, who would bring freedom to the world. They knew they had to encourage Jesus to be a godly dreamer, so he would have courage to share his dream. The dream that all people are loved by God, and through God we can change the world for the positive. Jesus would not be the last dreamer. As God's song and as God's Son, Jesus was the inspiration for dreamers. T.E. Lawrence, the famed Lawrence of Arabia, said this about those who dream: all people dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds awake to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of day are dangerous people, that they act their dreams with open eyes and make it possible. Today we need dreamers. We need people of passion and principle who refuse to give up and seek hope. In our churches and our spiritual life, we need to encourage dreamers to dream and have visions and to share their vision for what's possible. From the words of Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that has. And when we discover dreamers who reveal hope for our world, we need to encourage and equip them to pursue the dream of possibilities of a new creation through Jesus Christ. And we must declare, until all are free. May we help the dreamers, and may we act to fulfill the dreams we've received. Now, before we get too excited about that, though, you must heed this warning. There are many powers to be who will attempt to bury the dream. But if you are daring to bring a dream to reality, then let us do so with our eyes wide open. And as we encounter persons who resist our change, let us just know that God leads the way, and that the dreams of the ancient and modern prophets will be fulfilled. A fulfillment that God's love reigns over hate, and freedom will prevail for all people. And as Isaiah says, and all flesh will see it. And seeing it, we shall one day overcome.